Okay, today we are going to be doing Grade 6, Module 3, Lesson 11. We're going to talk about absolute value in terms of magnitude and distance. So the beginning of this unit talks about the absolute value of 10 is written as, and you can see the picture right here, is a picture of the number 10 with two lines next to it. That's how we say absolute value. When anyone says absolute value, you should be thinking about this picture with the number and the two lines on both sides of it. Not one, you have to have both lines. On the number line, we count the number of units from 10 to 0. And so if we were to do that, we would know, if we said how many units are from 10 to 0, we should know that that number is 8. There are 8 units from, I'm sorry, 10. There are 10 units from 10 to 0. 10 units. So if we say the absolute value of 10 is, our answer should be just 10. When we talk about absolute value, we do not talk about the signage of positive or negative. It is always going to look like a positive number. So people will say that the number is always positive because we're not talking about which way we're going. We're just talking about a distance from, and that's the hardest concept to understand about absolute value. The easiest one is to say there is just no negative numbers. It's always positive. So, what other number has an absolute value of 10? The same answer, and this is what I was just talking to you about. If we count the distance between 10, negative 10, and 0, we'll find that it is also 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 units away. This is also 10 units away. Notice I didn't put a negative sign. I didn't talk about which way we were going. I didn't say we were going this way. I just said, what's the distance from negative 10 to 0? And so that's why we put that without a negative sign. We just say it's 10 units away from 0. So what other number has an absolute value of 10? That would be negative 10, and that's because it's 10 units away from 0. Okay, so we would say that negative 10, the absolute value of negative 10 is 10 because negative 10 is 10 units from 0, and negative 10 and 10 are opposites. The absolute value of a number is just the distance between the number and 0 on the number line. And we have to maintain that. That's the most important concept to get from absolute value in this lesson. So let's talk about what that means exactly. Where it says complete the following chart, we write the number 6, the number negative 6, but we have to write it as absolute value. So again, we have to write the line, negative 6, and then another line. That means the absolute value of negative 6, which means how many units is the distance between negative 6 and 0. And we should know that that's 6 units. So if we started at negative 6 and we went to 0, that would be 6 units. A different number with the same absolute value would be positive 6. Because if we started at positive 6 and we went to 0, we would also move 6 units. Okay, going back to number 2, what about the number 8? The absolute value of 8, so if we went from 8 to 0, that would be 8 units. So that's 8. Now a different number with the same absolute value would be negative 8, because negative 8 is the same distance to 0. Negative 8 to 0 is just 8 units also. So a different number with the same absolute value would be negative 8. Okay? What about negative 1? The absolute value of negative 1, oops, don't make a curve, don't make it, has to be a straight line. To go from negative 1 to 0, that's just 1 unit. So the absolute value is 1. Therefore, a different number with the same absolute value should be positive 1. Positive 1 goes to 0, and that is only 1 unit. So that would be positive 1. We're only talking about distance. When we talk about absolute value, we're only talking about distance. All right, moving on. Here's with the other thing. now that we've talked about absolute value in terms of distance, how can we use absolute value in terms of magnitude? Magnitude means how big or how small something is. It's kind of the same as distance. It's just another word. You will see the word magnitude often when you're talking about word problems and absolute value. So I don't want to make you think that all the absolute value is the distance, because you are going to have questions having to do with magnitude, particularly with word problems, which is really what math is all about. So Mr. Owens received a call from her bank because she had a checkbook balance of negative $45. That means she owes money. That means she withdrew and there wasn't enough money in the bank to cover something that she withdrew either with a debit card or with a check. So now her bank is negative $45, her bank balance, her bank account balance. So what is the magnitude of the amount overdrawn? That means how much money is she overdrawn? So we show magnitude, the word magnitude, by writing the absolute value of negative 45. The negative 45 is the integer. If we want to know the magnitude of that number, then we want to know the absolute value. The absolute value of negative 45 is the distance from negative 45 to 0, which we've just talked about is very clearly 45 units. So the magnitude of the amount overdrawn is 45. If we put that back into the situation, we can say that Mrs. Owens overdrew her checking account by $45. Now, you could have given me this if I asked you how much did she overdraw the account by. But I want you to understand that when you're asked the question, you're going to be asked the question using this word magnitude. And so I want you to understand what that means. Okay? The magnitude of a measurement is the absolute value of its measure. Now that we know how to do absolute value, given the word magnitude, knows that we need to apply what we know about absolute value. All right, exercise 4 through 19. For each scenario below, use absolute value to determine the magnitude of each quantity. Because this is a tough concept for people to understand, we're going to spend some time talking about magnitude and different ways that you could be asked the question of the magnitude. So, starting with number 4. Maria was sick with the flu, and her weight change as a result of it is represented by negative 4 pounds. We know that negative 4, because you're the flu, you lose pounds. So you have to understand the situation. She was sick, she lost pounds. They represented it by negative 4. Negative 4 pounds is a loss of pounds. How much weight did Maria lose was the question. They don't want you to write negative 4 pounds. They want you to write the absolute value of negative 4, because we want to stop talking about it in terms of pounds. We just want to write down the absolute value of the integer is, and how many units is it from negative 4 to 0? 4. So how much weight did she lose? You write that Maria lost 4 pounds. And it's that simple. We don't write Maria lost negative 4 pounds. That's not what we're looking for, and that's the big difference here. When we talk about absolute value, we don't talk about positive or negative. It's really just anything. If people ask, yes, it is positive. It is a positive number. But the bottom line is they just want to know how many pounds she lost. They don't want you to show them a sign. Okay, so number 5, we're going to do the same thing. Jeffrey owes his friend $5. How much is Jeffrey's debt? Now notice it doesn't say magnitude in this time. Just like in the last one it didn't say magnitude, it said loss of pounds. His debt, you have to know that the vocabulary word debt means you owe somebody. So if you're in debt, then you're in the red and you owe somebody. So if his friend is $5 in debt, then we can say that the absolute value of the integer 5 is 5. And so how much is Jeffrey's debt? Can now say Jeffrey has a $5 debt. How much is his debt? His debt is $5. We can put the measurement back in. Just like over here, we put the pounds back in, but we didn't when we were doing the workout. When we're working over here, we put the debt back in and the dollar sign back in, the measurement back in. But when we were working with it as just an integer. All right. The elevation of Niagara Falls, which is located between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, is 326 feet. How far is this above sea level. So we know it's above sea level. Honestly, it doesn't matter. because we have to say, we have to take a 326 feet, and we need to know the distance between how far it is above sea level. We don't need to know if it's positive or negative. So we're going to take our integer of 326. We're going to find the absolute value, and that's going to be just 326. It doesn't matter how big the number is. The absolute value is just that number without any sign. So to answer the question, how far is this above sea level? We're going to put the measurement of feet back in, and we're going to put the words above sea level in. And we're going to say it is 326 feet above sea level. Hopefully at this point you're getting the hang of it, but let's keep going. How far below zero is 16 degrees Celsius? So if we're looking at below zero, it doesn't really matter. To find out how far below zero it is, that's the distance. That means absolute value. So we're going to write the absolute value of negative 16 is, the distance from negative 16 to 0 is just 16. It doesn't matter which way we're going. We do know that we're below 0, and we do know that we're talking about degrees, so in our answer we're going to put those back in. So how far below 0 is 16 degrees Celsius? We can say that negative 16 degrees below 0 is 16 degrees below 0. Just like when we were writing the information like that before, we couldn't say negative 16 degrees and below 0. We had to say either 16 degrees below 0 or negative 16 degrees Celsius. That's where that one comes in. All right. Frank received a monthly statement for his college savings account. It listed a deposit of $100 as plus $100. That's positive $100. It listed a withdrawal of $25 as negative 25.00, minus $25. The statement showed an overall balance of $835.50. How much money did Frank add to his account that month? How much did he take out? What is the total amount Frank has saved for college? Okay, so we have to first write out the information. This is when you have so much information you can't just jump into it. You have to write the information out. So we have to say we have a deposit of $100. So positive 100. And then we have a withdrawal of $25, so negative 25. And then we have a new balance of $835.50. So the first thing we're going to do is find the absolute value for each one of these integers. Sorry, rational numbers. We have a rational number here with 835.50. So the absolute value of 100 is 100. The absolute value of negative 25 is 25. And the absolute value of 835.50 is 835, and a half, or in 50/100th. Okay. Now we're just going to take each question. There are 3 questions here. The first one was, how much money did Frank add to his account that month? They don't want to know positive. They don't want to know that. They just want to know how much money. So our first sentence, that Frank added $100 to his account. That's all they want to know. The next question was, how much money did he take out? How much did he take out? Well, we know that the distance of the amount that he took out would have been 25. So we're going to put back in the other words like measurements of money, so that we can now say that Frank took $25 out of his account. It's really that easy, I promise you. The last question was, what is the total amount Frank has saved for college now? Then we look at our last amount right here. So the total amount of Frank's savings for college is, and I'm going to squeeze it in, 800, I'm going to put my dollar sign back, going to write it correctly. $835.50. All right. Number 9. Meg is playing a card game with her friend Iona. The cards have positive and negative numbers printed on them. Meg exclaims, "The absolute value of the number on my card equals 8. What is the number on Meg's card? Well, actually, the number on Meg's card could be one of two numbers. The number could be positive 8, because the absolute value of positive 8 is 8. But it could also be negative 8, because the absolute value of negative 8 is also 8. And if she's saying the absolute value of it on her card equals 8, it could be either one, and so you really can't tell what her number is. Okay. 10 says, list a positive and negative number whose absolute value is greater than 3. And then justify your answer using the number line. Well, let's make this one really good. Let's make this one that's going to blow your mind. We're going to list a positive and a negative number where the absolute value is greater than 3. So our number has to be greater than 3. Notice that it's pointing to the smaller number. If we're using an absolute value, let's start with a positive number, because we know that one pretty easy. Any number, if we're drawing a number line, and here's one way we can draw this, okay? Okay, so here's a number line. We want a number to be greater than 3, so we know that that number has to be one of these numbers or more. So, that being the case, we could say 4. So the absolute value of 4 is 4, and we know that 4 is in fact greater than 3. In fact, we could say 5, because 5 is greater than 3. The absolute value of 5 is 5. The absolute value of 6 is 6, and that's greater than 3. So any of those numbers, in fact, we could say, here's how you write this, it's kind of funky. Any number after 3, the absolute value is going to be greater than 3. But let's look at some negative numbers now. This was where it gets fun. The number -1, if we did -1 and we found the absolute value, that would be 1. 1 is not greater than 3, so that doesn't work. 2 would not work. -2 would not work, because the absolute value of -2 is 2. And 2, which is that answer, is not greater than 3. So that does not work. Even -3 won't work. Losing my number line here. Let me show you why. The absolute value of -3 is 3. And since we're looking at this number here, 3 is not greater than 3. It's equal to 3. So that won't work either. What about -4? -4, the absolute value of -4 is 4. And that answer is greater than 3. What about -5? The absolute value of -5 is 5, and that number is greater than 3. In fact, if we did all the absolute values of the negative numbers from -4 on, it would all make this statement true. So we could say -4 all the way down. All those numbers are going to make this statement true. That's the cool part about that. All right, number 11. Which of the following situations can be represented by the absolute value of 10? Check all that apply. So let's make sure we know this. To say the absolute value of 10, going to equal 10. Okay? The temperature is 10 degrees below zero. Express this as an integer. Well, this is not telling us to find out what the distance is or how far below zero it is, so that actually doesn't work. Okay, so because this asks us to do the integer, the answer to that would be negative 10, and they want to know which one is going to equal that. So that's not it. Determine the size of Harold's debt if he owes $10. So when we're talking about someone's debt, now that's different. This can be seen, debt we know is, if he owes $10, if we found the absolute value of that, that would equal 10. So we can use the absolute value to find this answer out. So that is correct. All right, determine how far negative 10 is from 0 on a number line. That is what absolute value is all about. So that does fit this. So yes, we can use absolute value to find that. 10 degrees is how many degrees above, when it asks you how many degrees above 0, how many particularly, that is also an absolute value situation. When you just want to know how many degrees, well, how far is the distance above 0, then we can use absolute value for that. So the only one we could not use it for was the one that asked us to express as an integer, because that's not the same thing as asking for absolute value unless it says what's the absolute value. In this situation, if they had said what's the absolute value of the integer, that would have been different. They didn't say that. That one doesn't apply. So that one doesn't work. Number 12. Julia used absolute value to find the distance between 0, good, that's what you're supposed to, and 6 on a number line. She then wrote a similar statement to represent the distance between 0 and negative 6. Below is her work. Is she correct? Well, let's see what she wrote. She wrote the absolute value of 6 is 6. That's true. That's a true statement. Then she wrote the absolute value of negative 6 is negative 6. Is that a true statement? No, because you don't have any negative sign, so it's not a true statement. That's where our explanation comes in. So let's see how we can write this, how the best we can explain this. Well, you could say, no, she is not correct. The distance is 6 units whether you go from 0 to 6 or negative 6 to 0. So the absolute value of negative 6 should also be 6. But Judith wrote negative 6, so she had it incorrect. If you were the teacher, you would have the joy or sadness of marking it incorrect. Mostly it would be sad. Number 13 says, use absolute value to represent the amount in dollars of a $238.25 profit. All we need to do for this one is write out the absolute value. The absolute value of $238.25 is, doesn't matter if it's profit or debt or whatever it is, they just want absolute value, so it's 238.25. We don't write the dollar sign because they're not asking us to refer back to any problem. They're not asking us any of the question. They want us only to do absolute value. That's important to know what information to give them. Number 14, Judy lost 15 pounds. Use absolute value to represent the number of pounds Judy lost. So they're not asking us to answer any question. We just need to write the absolute value of the 15 pounds that she lost, which would be the absolute value of negative 15. Let me write that nice and clear, because a loss of 15 pounds would be negative 15. And the absolute value of that would be 15. It's important when you're asking to do this that you show the loss inside the absolute value sign. You show that negative sign. All right. Now, in math class, Carl and Angela are debating about integers and absolute value. Carl said, 2 integers can have the same absolute value. And Angela said, 1 integer can have 2 absolute values. Who is right? And then we have to defend our answer. Well, if we have a number line down here, and we've drawn, and we've drawn out some numbers, we want to test out what Carl says versus what Angela says, we would say this. Carl says that two integers can only have the same absolute value. So the integer 2 and negative 2 would have the absolute value of 2, right? Angela says that integers can have two absolute values. So if we took 3, and we'll make it red so we know, 3, and we brought that to 0, that's 3 units. Negative 3 is also 3 units. In order for Angela to be correct, we'd have to find at least one example where one integer can have two absolute values. But 3 is always going to have 3 as an absolute value. Negative 3 is always going to have 3 as an absolute value. So sounds like she's mixing things up, because a positive 3 and a negative 3, which are two different integers, two different rational numbers if you use fractions, they have the same absolute value. So I think it's safe to say that Carl is correct, because if we're saying two integers can have the same absolute value, we've just proven that with the negative 3 and the positive 3. But one integer cannot have two absolute values. It's more like one absolute value can represent two integers. I think she's talking about it backwards. Okay, so now we got the fun part of explaining it. We have to defend our answer. So we already know Carl is right. So now to defend our answer. All right. So you could just pretty much give the definition of absolute value and say that Carl is right. An integer and its opposite are the same distance from 0. So they have the same absolute values, because absolute value is the distance between the number and 0. When you're giving the definition as one of your reasons, you can't go wrong. Number 16. Jamie told his math teacher, "Give me any absolute value and I can tell you two numbers that have that absolute value." Is Jamie correct? For any given absolute value, will there always be two numbers that have that absolute value? I'm going to go ahead and ask you to answer these questions, but these questions are not right or wrong answers today, just so that you know. Well, the easy answer appears to be, yeah, he's right. Any numbers that you give, you can have an absolute value. So, for example, you could say -6. You could say if the absolute value is 6, you could put two different numbers in there and still get 6. You could put -6 and you could put regular 6, number 6, positive 6, sorry. You could put, if two absolute values were 1, you could put -1, you could put +1. If the two absolute values were, let's make it a good number, 625 was the answer. It would be positive 625 and negative 625. So it seems like Jamie's right. That's what he told his math teacher. Give me any absolute value, 625, 1, 6, and I'll give you two numbers that will have that same absolute value, that will have that same answer. Seems like he's right, yeah? There's something that we didn't think about. It's kind of like a math trick. It's kind of like magic. Remember I said that if you have even one instance where you can prove it wrong? The absolute value of 0 is 0. And since 0 is neither positive nor negative, that is just one number. There is no -0. It's just the absolute value of 0. So in this case, if I say, what's the absolute value of 0, you can only give me one other number that is the absolute value of 0, and that is 0. You can't say positive 0 or -0 because there is no such thing. So that was a trick. Don't worry about getting that one right or wrong because it was a trick answer. So Jamie is not correct because 0 is its own opposite. only one number has an absolute value of 0, and that would be 0. That's the only time it's going to be wrong now. Other than that, Jamie would have been correct. Number 17. Use a number line to show why a number and its opposite have the same absolute value. So let's pick a number. In this case, we can pick any number. So let's take the number -5 and the number +5. If we want to show that its opposite, they have the same absolute value, all we have to do is we can actually draw the units. 3, 4, 5 units here. From -5 to 0. And from +5 to 0, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we've visually shown how these have the same absolute value. And then you can write the words out if you wanted to as well. Number 18, a bank teller assisted 2 customers with transactions. When you give money or get money or even inquire about something and they go into your account, that's called a transaction. One customer made a $25 withdrawal from a savings account. The other customer made a $15 deposit. So we have a $25 withdrawal and a $15 deposit. Use absolute value to show the size of each transaction. Which transaction involved more money? So that's the question we're trying to find out. But we have 2 things we have to do. We have to use absolute value. First off, the first one is a $25 withdrawal, so that would be the absolute value of -25. Remember and note, I am not putting in the $sign because you don't do that. We know that that equals the number 25. And then the other transaction was $15 deposit, so that would be the absolute value of +15, and that is 15. The absolute value of 15 is 15. So now we've used the absolute value. The last thing we have to do is answer the question, which transaction involved more money? Well, this one involved more money, so we have to go back and describe what this one was. That's where we go back and we put in this information here. So the $25 withdrawal involved more money. Okay, number 19, which is farther from 0? -7 3/4 or +7 1/2? Use absolute value to defend your answer. Well, the easy part of it is we write -7 3/4 and we find the absolute value of that. We've already learned, it's very simple, it is just 7 3/4 units away from 0. And then if we found the absolute value of 7 1/2, that is just 7 1/2 units away. So the tricky part comes with which one is farther from 0, 7 3/4 or 7 1/2? Well, you know that 7 1/2 is halfway between 7 and 8, and 7 3/4 would be, if we're looking at it this way, because this is what we need to do, and folks are still struggling with this, so you want to make sure you do this. Because these numbers are now absolute values are positive numbers. We can look and say 7 is here, 8 is here, 7 1/2 would be directly in the middle. 7 3/4 would be if we took the 7 to 8 and we broke it up into 4 parts. So 1 part, 2 part, 3 parts, 4 parts. At the 3 parts, that's 7 3/4. So which one is farther away from 0? 7 3/4. This one is. And that's how you can determine whether or not which number is greater and less than as well. That's an area that people have still been struggling with. So one way you can say it is that the number that is farther from 0 is 7 3/4. And this is because the absolute value of -7 3/4 is 7 3/4. And the absolute value of 7 1/2 is 7 1/2. When compared on the number line, 7 3/4 is farther away from 0 than 7 1/2 is. Okay, problem set. For each of the following 2 quantities in problems 1 through 4, which has the greater magnitude? So they've already given us the key. Magnitude means we need to use absolute value to defend our answers. So as always, I like to try and do the first one before I start asking you questions, or maybe not as always, but most of the time I like to do this. The first two numbers for number 1 is $33 and negative $52. So the absolute value of $33 of 33 is 33, and the absolute value of negative 52 is 52. So which one has the greater magnitude? Well, there's two ways you can write it, but we like to write the greater number first, so 52 is greater than 33. Therefore, or so, negative $52 has the greater magnitude. Number 2 says negative 14 feet and negative 23 feet. Using the same idea, tell me which one has the greater magnitude. Hopefully on your paper you wrote the absolute value of negative 14 is 14, and the absolute value of 23 is 23. Therefore, 23 is greater than 14. And then you have to go back to the original statement. So negative 14 feet has the greater magnitude. The next one is negative 24.6 pounds and negative 24.58 pounds. That'll be a little bit more challenging for people. I'm going to try to squeeze mine in here. Well, if you wrote this down, the absolute value of 24.6 is 24.6, and the absolute value of 24.58 is 24.58. Sorry, of negative 24.6 and then negative 24.58. Negative 24.6, the absolute value is 24.6, and the absolute value of 24.58 is 24.58. If you remembered, and I've told you this before, I've told different people, I don't know who exactly, when you have the number, you can just put the 0 and make it a pair, and then you can look at it like money. So let's say we were talking about money. $24.60 is farther away from the 0 than $24.58. So if we had to write which one is greater, we would say 24.6 is greater than 24, that's not 24, 24.58. Don't let the decimals scare you. If you're trying to compare, look at them like money. But then go back to what they really are. So negative 24.6 pounds has the greater magnitude. Okay, to do the next one, I'm going to need to erase some of these, so bear with me for a minute. Okay, so I've only gotten rid of the numbers that we've drawn in, so I can do the last one. The answers are still on the right-hand side. The last one, number 4, says negative 11 and 1/4 degrees and 11 degrees. So you start by writing the absolute value of each, and then you fill in the answer. All right, now I've written it right. Now I've written it correctly. Negative 11 and 1/4 is, the absolute value of that is 11 and 1/4. And the absolute value of positive 11 is 11. So if we had to decide which one had the greater magnitude, hopefully that's pretty simple to see. It would be 11 and 1/4 is greater than 11. So 11 and 1/4 is greater than 11. And so to write down which one has a greater magnitude, we go back to what it originally said. All right, moving on. For problems 5 through 7, we're just going to answer true or false, but here's the catch. If it's false, we need to explain why. So the absolute value of a negative number will always be a positive number. Is that true or false? Hopefully you remember that earlier I mentioned that that is a true statement. Even though we don't say positive, it is a positive number. We're not ever going to use a negative number to talk about absolute value. Okay, number 6. The absolute value of any number will always be a positive number. This one you might think is true because the one before it is true, and it might seem correct, but it's actually false. And it's because of the 0. 0 is neither positive nor negative, and therefore the absolute value of 0 is always going to be 0. It's not going to be positive or negative. So that one would be a false, and our reasoning, I'll write it down here so that we know. Okay, 0 is the exception since the absolute value of 0 is 0, and 0 is not positive. All right, number 7, positive numbers will always have a higher absolute value than negative numbers. Is that a true statement or a false statement? Well, that's a false statement because, and that's a false statement because a number and its opposite have the same absolute value. So that's why it's false. All right, that was 5, 6, and 7. And now we only have one more, and then we are done with Ed Puzzles for math for this year. Number 10 says, look at the bank account transaction listed below and determine which has the greatest impact on the account. See the use of the word? We've used a bunch of different words to show you when you would use absolute value. The greatest impact means absolute value. So, you either have a withdrawal of $60, a deposit of $55, or a withdrawal of $58.50. Well, the first one, let's do the absolute value for each one to see which one has the greatest impact on the account. A withdrawal of $60 would be negative 60, and the absolute value of negative 60 is 60. And then a deposit of $55 would be 55 positive, and the absolute value of positive 55 is 55, and a withdrawal of $58.50. And the absolute value of $58 and positive $58, no, that's a withdrawal. So that would be a negative. Try that again. The absolute value of negative $58, or 58.50, because now we're talking about the rational number and not the actual dollar measurement, is 58.50. We go back to the question, which one has the greatest impact, which means which one has the greatest absolute value, and that would be this one. So if we go back to what this one is when we're writing our answer down, we would have to say that a withdrawal of $60 would have the greatest, that's a nest, impact on the account balance. All I've done was I took the information and I rewrote it with the information they gave me. And that was my explanation. Well, part of the explanation is the work we did right here too. And ladies and gentlemen, that is it. Now all you have to do for the rest of this week is one more IXL for this year. You get to play a game on Prodigy Game, and you'll play another game on Legends of Learning, which if you just get on there and give it a whirl, you'll get credit for it. Just make sure you go on and you try it. Have a great time.